Shall we? Wonderful. All right. I guess we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are so thrilled that you're here and joining us for our discussion today. 1 year after the fall of Roe, another domestic violence woe. Thank you, Colleen.
It was a joint effort.
Yes.
Did you like the
It was
ride?
a joint effort, actually.
It was.
If you're a repeat visitor here, welcome back and thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time here, welcome to our table. I'm Megan Rosado. I'm the Training and Education Coordinator here at CAWC, and I'm joined by my colleague, Colleen Montgomery, who is the Outreach Services Coordinator here at CAWC. You want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Yes, good afternoon. Glad you're here.
So we sincerely appreciate your time and your willingness to show up and learn about how we can further the movement for safety, choice, and justice for all. To all of our supporters who have helped make this content possible, we are sustained through your generosity, and we sincerely thank you. Your contributions will help fund expansion of our content and improving our studio space, right?
Yeah.
Our little makeshift kitchen that we have here at CAWC, our kitchen table.
Yes.
We also want to thank our staff behind the scenes here, our folks from our development team. So Via, Jessica, Celia, thank you very much for your support. And also a special thank you to Colleen for all of your work preparing for today's, doing the research and making everything look good. Great work.
Thanks, Megan.
So there will be a recording of today's conversation available on our website. We will send a link via email to everyone that signed up, along with information about how you can continue your advocacy, learn about new kitchen table conversations by signing up for our newsletter and following us on social media. So once again, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to this conversation. We would like you to join in the conversation by sharing your thoughts in the comments. If you have specific questions that you want to put in the Q&A pod, that will help us keep track of those, and we will jump right in.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I love that transition. It never gets old, those fun curtains. So for our main content for today's presentation is about what's been happening in our country since in the past year, since the fall of Roe v. Wade, which, as we know, occurred in 2022 from the Dobbs v. Jackson ruling. And so it's been a little over a year since that ruling officially came out. And if you remember the leaked ruling that came out in May, I believe that was. So we had like double points of crisis last year, if you remember. But here at the Kitchen Table Conversations, we love a good history lesson. Mm-hmm. And we know that history builds on itself and repeats itself. So we're going to do just a brief overview of some important things that have happened over the last, 200, 300-ish years in our country that are really going to help build our discussion for today. Now, this is by no means exhaustive or everything that has happened that has affected the movement for reproductive justice, but just some things that tie into our work for today. So starting in 1787 is, maybe as you know, when our Constitution was first signed. And this is a painting of when it was ratified in Philadelphia. And as we can see, it's all white men in this picture. Mm-hmm. Megan, can you see what we're missing in this picture?
I don't see any women.
No
rights. I don't see any people of color.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, at that point, we didn't have people that were out particularly, mm-hmm. in terms of other identities, but certainly, so that's not present either.
Yes. Yeah, no representation except for white male power holders. From that time up until 1992, which is a benchmark here I'm going to talk about, abortion was legal. So when the Constitution was written and this country was, wasn't founded, when the country was first invaded by people from England, people were having abortions here, and it was mostly white women of some class, middle class or upper class, who with the other people who came to America brought their laws from England, which included the right to access abortion. So from 1700s through the early 1800s, the concern was not whether abortion was legal or not, or healthcare or not. The concern was if abortion was safe. That was what they were worried about. And obviously that has changed and become very different now. So in about the 1850s was when the criminalization of abortion really started to happen in what we see in the history, and the criminalization of abortion and women. And the white male power holders were becoming fearful of the women who were becoming healers and midwives and providing abortions for other women in the country. They were wanting to join medical schools to become a part of the education system in our country, which was a threat apparently to the white men who were in power. And so what we saw was movements for anti-abortion to prevent these women healers from having jobs and accessing education, and to prevent the rights of women to choose how their lives looked like. This image here is a picture from a New York newspaper that shows a woman who we assume was giving an abortion, and there's like a demon, a flying demon eating the baby, I believe, which as far as I know has never been an option of how to get an abortion. But just an image to show what that campaign looked like. In 1969, during this time, different organizations and coalitions developed to continue providing abortions, because as we know, even if abortion is illegal, it's still happening. And there's a higher risk for it being unsafe and causing mortality during the abortion due to the practices. So in 1969, these are some images from a group that developed in Chicago, and it was called the Abortion Counseling Service of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. And they created an underground abortion service for people in Chicago and people coming out of Chicago to get safe, inexpensive, accessible abortions. And so during this time period, they provided about 11,000 abortions for various women and birthing persons. 1973 is, of course, when Roe v. Wade was first ruled and became law. This ruling declared that all women, which was the words they used, we now use the word birthing person to acknowledge that people of all genders can have access, can need abortions. But this declared that all women had the right, which I'm going to highlight there, we're going to keep talking about that, the right to terminate a pregnancy until the fetus was viable outside the womb. And now this movement was built by white women who had some class and some status, who learned from the civil rights movements of the 50s and the 60s of how to have a movement, how to have a social movement, how to advocate for power. So they built off of, in particular, Black individuals who were fighting for their civil rights. But unfortunately, in the fight for Roe v. Wade, those Black individuals and Black birthing people were left out of this conversation. So this movement, when Roe v. Wade occurred, was very centered on white women and the idea of a white suburban woman needing access to abortion, which they do, and we agree with that, and that is not the only way to live. More on that in a little bit. What I also want to point out is in 1989, so when Roe v. Wade was happening, that what I just described could be considered white feminism. In 1989 was the first time that intersectional feminism came about in written word and in description. And that was by a law student. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she has a number of books out that are really great. But she described intersectional feminism to address these things that I'm talking about, that there's not just one way to be a woman and have a female experience or a birthing person's experience, and that there are different types of oppressions that can affect the different social identities of people. And in particular for women, their racial identity, their class identity, the different social groups that they identify within. To continue to illustrate how Black women in particular were left out of this conversation, we have the Hyde Amendment that came about and was signed in 1976. And the Hyde Amendment stated that Medicaid funds could not be used to pay for abortions. And that's still in effect today. And what we know is that, let's see, due to, how did I write this? Due to the structural inequities of our country in education, healthcare, housing, you name it, we know that disproportionately people of color are on Medicaid compared to white individuals. So disallowing Medicaid from providing abortions disproportionately negatively impacts people of color in our country. This is a chance to point out the difference between right versus access. And just because it's written in the law, the Roe v. Wade at this time, that everybody had a right to abortion, lots of people, in particular people of color, especially because of the Hyde Amendment, did not have access to that abortion.
And I'll just add that this is a discussion that I was just having with our development team right before this session, of all the different ways in which the specific movement for ending domestic violence mirrors, so many of these other issues that we see in the women's movement. And also, again, how we got our start by understanding organizing principles coming from earlier on with the civil rights movement and things. So
exactly. Yeah, thank you. 1992, this was to showcase the Planned Parenthood versus CAWC federal case that came in. And I highlight this one because it was a challenge to Roe v. Wade, similar to Dobbs v. Jackson. But when this occurred and the Supreme Court justices who were in chair at that time in office voted this down. So this was a threat against Roe v. Wade that did not advance. And due to the voting from the Supreme Court justices in this case, Roe v. Wade stood. So I bring that up just to highlight, as we know, who is on the Supreme Court matters. 1994 was the first time that we have in writing, and these ideas were happening, the concept of reproductive justice, which you're going to hear us repeating. You've heard us say that already, and you're going to hear us keep talking about it today. And so this was first articulated in 1994, actually in Chicago, at a national pro-choice conference by an informal Black Women's Caucus that met in Illinois with the Pro-Choice Alliance, again in Chicago. So what do we mean when we say reproductive justice? Reproductive justice is the human right to control our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. Now, alternately, reproductive coercion, which we certainly talk about in the domestic violence field and see, is forcing pregnancy or not supporting your decisions about when or if to have children. Unfamiliar? Lastly, when I say it sounds familiar, is pretty much exactly what happened with the Dobbs v. Jackson ruling, is that's what happened in 2022. So Dobbs v. Jackson made the right to abortion illegal at a federal level, and they said that the purpose was to make it a state's decision. And we're going to talk more about that later, as we know that is not necessarily true and very misleading. But what we also know is when this ruling came in, about 13 or 14 states had trigger laws that automatically outlawed abortion in their states, with varying degrees of exceptions for rape or incest, from allowing it to not allowing it at all. Thankfully, Illinois has done some really progressive work to make abortion more accessible through our state in the past year. There's been some new laws that Megan will talk about later to make it accessible and available for the residents of Illinois and people coming from out of state to get abortions in Illinois as well. So why do we talk about all of this? At CAWC, our mission statement is to end domestic violence, and we say that through rebuilding lives and renewing hope. And today we're going to show how we do that through the stories that we share in the fight for reproductive justice. We look at this as our mission statement for today's presentation. The fight against reproductive justice is rooted in racism, sexism, and classism, and reinforces the domestic violence dynamics of power and control, disproportionately negatively affecting women, BIPOC, LGBTQIA2S+ folks, and low-income families.
100%.
Period. Yeah. What we're also hoping that our presentation and our discussion does today is continue the discussion in our field to change the question from why do victims stay to why do abusers abuse? And we're going to show these dynamics of abuse in the systems that our country is built on and continues to build.
And thank you so much for asking that question, Colleen, because we're going to talk about that right now. So what you see in front of you, this is the power and control wheel that was originally developed by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project out of Duluth, Minnesota, and it was developed in 1984. It was at that point they were beginning to initiate partner abuse intervention services with people who cause harm in their relationships. And so this wheel was developed by going and conducting focus groups at survivor programming. So talking to all survivors over a period of several months about all of the different experiences they were having. And then ultimately they came up with this graphic that many wheels have been developed over time in order to give the idea in additional information about the experiences that survivors have across multiple different forms of violence. These wheels do give a universal idea of the dynamics, but they may not be true for every survivor. And also it's not exhaustive. As you'll see here, we don't have specifically reproductive coercion, right?
Yeah.
Spelled out here, although we're going to talk about how it relates to all of the different areas on this wheel. So it's not a completely exhaustive list, but it definitely gives some insights, and it's very helpful as an educational tool. The original diagram, which is depicted here, does assume she and her pronouns for survivors, he and him pronouns for the people who are causing harm. But we do know that many of these abusive behaviors happen in all relationships, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. And so when we look at this wheel, we think of it as a diagram of all of the different tactics, as I mentioned, that an abusive partner uses to establish power and maintain power and control in a relationship. In addition to illustrating just the multiple different forms of abuse, the inside of the wheel is comprised of the subtle and more continual behaviors, while the outer ring really represents the physical and sexual violence. These are the behaviors that are more overt, more forceful, very intense, and definitely reinforce everything that is going on the inside of the wheel on this continual basis.
Yeah, we, as you know, we give this wheel out to almost everyone who we work with as a survivor at CAWC. And I feel like very often when we're educating them on this wheel and these subtle signs that you're talking about, we see a lot of, oh my goodness, yes, that's happening. I had no idea that was abusive. And so it can be very eye-opening, very educational.
Yeah, and really seeing how everything works together, right?
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, we do share this with survivors at our programs. We definitely share a gender neutral.
Yes.
And so again, there are many different versions of this wheel that, you're welcome to go and look up.
Yeah. Next slide.
And then this is a further development of the wheel. This is the culture wheel, and this is a visual representation of how cultural norms, values, and institutions reinforce the tactics of control that are used on the individual level. So in answer to your question, why do abusers abuse? There are so many different ways in which our society sets up expectations and, again, reinforces these tactics being used and being effective. So by examining these issues, we can see how we can identify actions that might be taken on personal, institutional, and cultural levels to end the societal and political acceptance of domestic abuse.
Well put. Thank you, Megan. Oh, we forgot our little graphics. Our highlights for the personal, institutional wheel, and then the culture wheel. I forgot the graphics. All right, main content. So we're going to use everything that Megan just talked about in this culture wheel as the anchor for our content today to show what are those examples. When Megan says that there are examples of abuse rooted in these different wheels, what does that mean? We're going to tell you. So as we go along, we're going to pick out 3 of these subtle tactics that Megan has talked about and give you 3 examples for each of those tactics to showcase how these wheels intersect. And to help hopefully make this an engaging and interactive discussion, we're going to ask you if you'd like to participate. As we talk about these stories, when you hear the words from these different rings, so the personal ring, we have the institutional ring, these words, and then the cultural ring. When you notice these things happening in these stories, share them in the chat, have a discussion with each other, share stories or examples that you know of or that you have seen, share reactions. What we're going to share is horrifying that's happening today, but the reality is we know that it is. So if you feel angry, good, you should feel angry. This stuff is bad. I say that we're also going to show you what we can do to help mitigate these issues, and then ultimately what you can do to further the movement for reproductive justice. All right. So we're going to start with economic abuse, and to just lay the groundwork and a reminder of what economic abuse looks in a DV lens and how it's described in this culture wheel. These are the main factors, and there's, it's not exhaustive. There's lots of more examples, but some main examples are preventing victims or the survivor from getting or keeping a job, forcing or coercing the victim to ask for money, giving them an allowance. If a victim is on Social Security or public benefits, forcing them to sign over those benefits to you, to the abuser, not letting them know or have access to their own family income. So really restricting anybody's rights to access to their own finances. So what does this look like? By removing access to reproductive justice and forcing births in this country, what's happening is it's forcing people to lead lives that they maybe don't want to lead, right? We are all about choice at CAWC, and this removes a choice from people depending on where they live. And this includes experiencing pregnancy. What we're also seeing with this fight against reproductive justice is it just reinforces systems of oppression that our country is built on and continue to exist with. In particular, people who hold power and decision-making for benefits or resources that can help people manage a family. And so, we pulled this cartoon to illustrate that this disproportionately affects Black women. And, if you've heard of the phrase welfare queen, we have that horrible stereotype that criminalizes Black women from having children. And yet this federal law makes it illegal for them at a federal level to have choices of how they want to build their family. Another example of this is it reinforces pregnancy discrimination in the workplace. So did we forget that pregnant people are discriminated against and we're taking away this choice for people to decide if they want to be pregnant or not? Pregnant discrimination happens in the workplace at all levels. And we reviewed a interview that was done by the New York Times, and this is a woman who experienced it. Her name is Otisha Woolbright, and she was working at Walmart and asked to stop lifting the heavy trays as she became pregnant. And I think it's pretty commonplace that we know pregnant people at some point are supposed to stop lifting heavy items, I believe. And she reported in this story that when she told her boss this, her boss said that she had seen Demi Moore do a flip on TV when she was nearly full term. What is this example? Why are we doing this? Like, not reality. So she said being pregnant was no excuse because Demi Moore could do a flip while she was pregnant. So
wouldn't we all like to be like Demi Moore?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. So we have this horrible example. And unfortunately, ultimately, this woman, Otisha Woolbright, she got hurt from lifting. So she was discriminated against in her right to access for adaptations in her job and then hurt herself on the job. This guy. Roll my eyes every time I see him. Okay. So this is Dr. Horatio Storer. And unfortunately, he is known as the father of American gynecology. He was around in the 1800s, and he was a huge part and leader of the movement that we talked about in the 1850s to criminalize abortion and criminalize women. He was also a Harvard Medical School alum, which will come into play later as we're talking. And I just want to read a couple of things here about these beliefs that he had and that he shared widely, supported by the American Medical Association, by the way, during this time. He asserted that married women had a moral obligation to reproduce, stating that the American Civil War, which ended in 1865, had caused devastating population losses. He created a pamphlet which said that he blamed every social vice, including ignorance, lust, selfishness, loose morals, and insanity, for the continued practice of abortion among women. And it doesn't end there, right? Okay, so all of that he's attributing to abortion. Now let's listen to what he's attributing to the women's body. So he then also delivers a lecture to the American Medical Association called On the Origins of Insanity in Women, in which he argued that women, and again, this is a man, he's not a woman, right? As far as we know, argued that in women, the uterus and the ovaries could either cause or amplify symptoms of insanity, and that the removal of a woman's ovaries was a potential treatment option for insanity in women.
Sterilization.
Yeah, exactly. So we can't have abortions. We can't have our reproductive organs. What do we have? Awful. Have you heard, so this is the father of American gynecology. Megan, have you heard of a mother of American gynecology?
No.
Yeah, neither had I. And so I looked it up, and there are some women who are considered the mothers of gynecology, and maybe some of you know about this. And they have a very different story than this Dr. Store. The mothers of modern gynecology are actually three enslaved Black women who were experimented on by a compatriot of Dr. Store without their consent and often without anesthesia. What am I thinking of? Anesthesia, the pain
medicine.
Yeah, pain medicine without any support. So no consent, no support. This is a prime example of racism in the medical system, which we know continues to exist today. And there's three women who are considered the mothers of gynecology. Their names are Anarcha Westcott, and then Lucy and Betsy. Unfortunately, we don't know their last names due to the history being whitewashed. But there is a statue that's been erected for them in New York. So, so that's something.
That's so interesting, because that's exactly what I was thinking when I said sterilization. Right away, I was thinking about all of the women of color, particularly Indigenous women and enslaved Africans that forced sterilization, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
For the benefit of white people.
Yep. Yep. Awful. Let's get him off the screen. All right, thanks. Let's talk about clients.
So, thank you for all of that information. And again, every time, and, when I first heard about the leak decision, my thoughts immediately went to the people that we serve here at CAWC and what this means for survivors of domestic violence. So, Heidi, we're going to share Heidi's story. The names are fictitious. This is a mixture of real clients, as well as some additional added elements in order to preserve confidentiality.
Yes.
So this is Heidi, and Heidi arrived at our shelter following an incident with her husband. In addition to having her daughter with her at the shelter, Heidi was also pregnant. This was the first incident of physical abuse that Heidi had experienced and didn't really identify as a victim or a survivor, and was very, very unsure about leaving the relationship. Her husband was in the military, so there were long periods of separation. He had recently experienced some combat. Was wondering if there was PTSD, and if the added stress, as well as any trauma effects, was maybe contributing to the violence and the abuse that she was beginning to experience. It is interesting that Heidi was pregnant, as we know that oftentimes abuse does escalate during pregnancy. So of course, I was not necessarily surprised to hear about this.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. So Heidi was very concerned about economic stability and an ability to support herself and her child and possibly future child if leaving. Again, little to no work history. And one of the dynamics that became apparent through getting to know Heidi and working with Heidi was that she had actually had another child previously given birth, and that child had passed away. And in addition to that child, also multiple pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. And so when we were looking at kind of the context of the whole relationship, one of the things that we saw was Heidi had really been pregnant a vast majority of the time, and or caring for a small child or a baby during the course of the relationship. So again, as you were mentioning, leading to less opportunities to establish work. So we worked with Heidi to provide information and assistance. We assisted Heidi in applying for cash benefits as well as supplemental SNAP benefits, as you see on the screen there, under the public aid benefits through Illinois Department of Family Illinois IDHS, Illinois Department of Human Services.
Mouthful.
And yes, it's all the acronyms, right?
Yes.
I usually do pretty well with them, but once in a while, even I get them all mixed up. And then when she first applied, questioned her eligibility, helped with providing information and advocating for her rights under the family violence exclusion, which I think is really important to recognize. Again, this was a result of organizing by domestic violence advocates at the time in the 90s, when that horrendous welfare reform was enacted in the mid 90s. So we assisted in applying for those benefits, and in getting access to those systems. We also provide information about Heidi's legal rights and referrals to attorney for consultation to find out about child support, right? Spousal support if deciding to go through a divorce, as well as custody. Heidi decided that she wanted to focus on getting some job training during this time, since she still wasn't sure. So we assisted and referred Heidi to some job readiness programs, and assisted with securing childcare, transportation, and then just general financial education. So one of the things that we do at our programs is talk about budgeting, talk about things like credit, getting and using credit, repairing credit if that's an issue for survivors. So this is just an example of some of the ways in which we address this particular issue with, one particular client.
Yeah, great example. I really appreciate that you point out the family violence exclusion program and how people coming together in a movement can impact change on these systems that we're talking about. And it's hard, and you burn out, and you have people with you who can lead through your burnout, and then you lead when they're burned out, right? It's grouping and coming together and fighting for what's right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, number 2. So our next subtle tactic that we're going to talk about is using privilege. And so what this looks like in a domestic violence relationship are these examples that you see on the screen here. So I want to just point out a few of these that are really pertinent to our discussion. Making all the big decisions, being the one to define the roles or the duties of the relationship. Using privilege or ability to discredit you, cut off access to resources, or use your system against you. I guess I'm just going to point out all of them because they're all important. Knowing what's best for you, and then we'll, throw in treating you like a servant. And of course, none of this is funny, but what we also, like Megan pointed out before, privilege does not just have to be male privilege. Privilege is any type of ism that somebody holds over another person. So this could be racism, classism, ableism,
heterosexism.
Thank you. Yes. Any of the isms could be used as a privilege and a tactic to exert power and control over another person. So what does this look like? So here's this guy. Our example is power holders voting against reproductive justice who are still accessing those choices for their own families. And so this man, his last name is Desjarlais. He was a state representative, no, a state congressman. I forget which state he was in. Tennessee. Thank you. Thank you to my notes. And so this man, a number of years ago, but it is a really important example. He, in every law that he was, or bill that he was voting for in Tennessee, voted against abortion rights for the people of his state and the people who voted for him. What he didn't tell them explicitly is that he was still helping his wife access abortions in their marriage, which we fully support as a choice, and then also supporting his mistress, which I don't like that term anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know what a better one would be right now, but we should definitely get rid of that term. But supporting her in accessing abortions for herself too, and not only supporting and accessing, but coercing her into abortions. And we know this because this guy recorded himself having a conversation with this woman where he is coercing her into getting an abortion. And let's add this into it. He's a doctor and this woman was a patient. So can we talk about ethical duty and crossing boundary lines? That woman had no opportunity to consent to a relationship because of the power that he held over her in the doctor-patient relationship. And then you add in that he has this power as a legislator, he has power as a white male, he has power with access to resources. It's an incredible example of privilege. Yeah.
Stunning.
Yeah.
Although not, right?
I guess, yeah.
There's
right.
more stories like this
Yeah.
than we can ever be aware of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This is just one. Thank you. Another example is using privilege to discredit, or I would say attempt to discredit opponents. And this representative, Megan and I were talking, we don't know if it's Gates or Getz or neither of those, and frankly we don't care. So maybe you know how to pronounce his name, but this is Matt Getz, representative from Florida, and this tweet, which is now turning into X apparently, so I don't know what we'll say with the new branding for Twitter, but this tweet he posted when the leaked opinion happened last May. And it was in response to many women, millions of women who came out in opposition of this Dobbs v. Jackson ruling. And he says, how many of the women rallying against overturning Roe are overeducated, underloved millennials who sadly return from protests to a lonely microwave dinner with their cats and no Bumble matches? What? Gross. I am a millennial with cats, and I love returning home to them after protesting for civil rights and human rights. Gross.
And some of us who are a little older out there might remember, you know, especially when the women's movement was having its heyday kind of in the 70s and 80s, you know, the bra burners, man haters, they're all lesbians, and all of the different ways in which you know, this has been consistently used throughout history. You were talking about this at the very beginning, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that horrible image of a woman and a demon eating a baby. What? And people, because these people are in positions of power, they have huge audiences of people who see this and believe
it. Somebody, what does that say? I don't have a cat, but I do have an air fryer.
I love that. Thank you, Lashana.
Excellent, excellent. Me too. I have an air fryer without cat.
See, we all lead the lives that we want to lead, our choices. This last example here for privilege is white supremacist ideals being used to control U.S. population by manipulating birthing persons' reproductive rights and access. And so this has been happening forever in our country. And I point out that this, you know, where I first saw it in the literature was when it was happening in the 1850s, talking about population control from these white men in power, and their fear of white women who were having access to abortions was going to decrease over time. And I don't obviously agree with this, so I feel gross saying this, but for education, it's important to reflect what's happening. But that white women who were getting abortions were decreasing the white population in the US, while the population of immigrants who were coming into the country who did not have the resources to access abortions, and enslaved Black women who did not have the resources or the access or the rights, I'm sure, to access abortions, were having babies that were of color. And so the white men in power saw this as a problem and used this to further their movement to criminalize abortion so that white women would stop having abortions to build up the white population in our country. Awful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jessica.
Thank you. And you know, I just have to say, Lashana, that cracked me up so much. I
You
teared up. I got a little teary from that last little chuckle. So thank you for that. So Jessica. So Jessica, I met Jessica when she arrived at our shelter program. She had been at the hospital following a mental health crisis. And upon arrival, in speaking to Jessica about her immediate needs, one of the things that she expressed was that she wanted to resume taking her medication. She had been prescribed medications for that was helpful in managing some of the symptoms that she was experiencing. And so that was really important to Jessica. She had run out. This is actually one of the tactics of control that her partner was using, was not allowing her access to go and get refills, regularly when she was, in need, and maybe even contributed to the need for that hospitalization of not having access to those medications. And so, I told Jessica that certainly this was something that we could assist with. That, I wanted to know more about the hospital stay. I was curious how come this hadn't already been addressed. And so asked Jessica to tell me more about that. And Jessica, shared that while she was at the hospital, she was given a pregnancy test, and that as a result of the religious affiliation of the hospital, the pregnancy test is obviously positive. They refused to give any prescriptions for these medications. So now Jessica is at the shelter, and we're having this discussion. So I then had questions. How did Jessica feel about getting this news about the pregnancy? And specifically, did Jessica have any of these same concerns about taking these medications? And so Jessica shared that no, this was not a planned pregnancy, and that Jessica did not have, the same concerns about the medication. So I did affirm that CAWC does believe that Jessica is the one that has rights to make choices about her own body, and asked if she was interested in exploring options, including abortion. And I think that it was really important that I named abortion, that I didn't just say, well, you have options, right? That I named that abortion was one of the options, made it clear that if that was something she was thinking about, we would support it. And if not, then we could talk about other options as well. And I'll tell you the relief that I saw expressed in that moment, just the visible sign of relief coming out of Jessica at that point was just really stunning. Wow. and very, touching, and something I'll always remember. And so again, I assured Jessica that this was something that we could assist with. First, let's talk about getting the medications, make a plan for that, getting that filled. Fine. Second, let's refer to Planned Parenthood to get more information about her rights, and possibly abortion if that's what she chose to follow through with. And she did choose to follow through with this, and thankfully in Chicago we still have that right to access, but it is not easy. And so we supported Jessica through that whole process, both financially by giving a referral to Chicago abortion funds, as well as emotionally and giving just really tangible supports.
Yeah. Sounds like you were very supportive to her, and you saw that right away in her response to you. I also really appreciate pointing out that vocalizing abortion as a right was really important, and calling it what it is. That was a huge part of the start of the domestic violence movement, was people talking about their stories and lifting those stories up. And that continues in the work that we do today, and can continue in your work as an advocate, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation.
And for those of you following along on the power and control wheel, you can see some of the systems mentioned here that we discussed.
Definitely. Great. All right, last one. Denying, minimizing, and blaming. In the domestic violence field, we see this, like all of them, all the time. But so to highlight some of these, blaming the victim or the survivor for the abuse, saying, well, if you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have hurt you this way. Erroneously saying that the victim deserved whatever abuse it was. Saying we're just fighting, it's not abuse. I didn't push you that hard. I didn't hurt you that bad. You're fine. You're being a baby. You're too sensitive. insensitive. This is all your fault, right? Saying it didn't happen, gaslighting could be considered denying, minimizing, and blaming, trying to alter the reality. Say, oh, I didn't say that in the past. You're misremembering what I said, or that's not what I meant. You misinterpreted what I said. And then throwing in some verbal abuse to try to, destroy somebody's self-esteem and their sense of self. So how have we seen this in our country at these higher levels? So this is another, what do we have here? I don't know. I don't have it in my notes. He was maybe a senator. He was definitely in the legislature in a state. And his last name is Aiken, and he is a strong anti-abortion legislator. And you might remember this one because this one went kind of viral from a few years ago. He was asked in an interview whether he supported allowing abortions for women who have been raped. And not every state allows abortions, who have restrictions on abortions. Some states have exceptions for rape cases. Some states don't, right? There's a degree. What this guy said is, it's not funny, but it's so ludicrous. From what I understand from doctors, such pregnancies are really rare. What does that even mean? And he added, if it's a legitimate rape, what does that mean? The female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. What? This is nonsense. Yeah. This is nonsense.
Yeah.
And I will say, from a trauma-informed care perspective, we do know that there are physiological effects in the body when trauma happens that can affect pregnancies and health in that way. But I'm not giving him any credit for using a trauma-informed perspective here. Yeah. This is nonsense.
Yeah. And I really question if there was, maybe there is a doctor that said this, but I question it.
It's possible.
Although you gave an example of doctors that have said some crazy things. So.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's one example. Our next example with this is this guy, another state senator who, this is from another tweet that happened more recently. He tweeted in response to Vice President Harris when either the leaked opinion came out of Dobbs v. Jackson or the actual ruling. And I'm just going to read what they said because I find it really powerful. Vice President Harris said, "Let us be clear. We trust the judgment of the women of America to make decisions based on what is in their best interest. We trust the women of America to make those decisions about their own bodies. The government should not be making that decision for them." And so this elected official, in response, he's from Utah. He said, again, it's not funny, but it's ludicrous. He said the baby is not part of the body of a woman. Wrong. He says the umbilical cord and placenta do not directly connect to the woman. Wrong. He says the baby floats inside the woman. Wrong. He says it's not about the woman's body. It's to kill, then remove the baby's body. It is done in greater proportion to Black babies. What is this nonsense? In a public forum, an elected person in a position of power spreading these lies.
I wonder if he has any daughters.
Good question. I don't know.
or any children who were assigned female at birth. Let's put it that way, right? Let me correct myself. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
This makes a really good point for why we need sex education.
Love it. Yeah.
And this education in our schools.
Yeah.
Because again, if he is the parent to somebody who was assigned female at birth, I really just can't imagine.
Yeah.
And this also reminds me of, especially as we're getting the start of the primary season underway with the elections, some of the some of the terms like after birth abortion, like how does that happen, right? Yes. And I just saw somebody giving a speech the other day. They went on about it for about 5 minutes, talking about like, oh, they're doing it post-abort, post-birth.
What?
That's not a thing.
That's not a thing. Confirmed. Thank you. All right, moving on to this one. Our topic is spreading false information in legal documents that become law. And of course, we have Supreme Justice Clarence Thomas
My
here.
buddy.
Your buddy.
No.
That was the one thing I don't believe coming out of your mouth. Clarence Thomas is in his own hot water right now, if you've been seeing the news stories that have been coming out about him, and forever justice for Anita Hill. He is on the slide to represent what part of his statement in the Dobbs v. Jackson ruling, where he said abortion is not a part of the Constitution when it was written. Wrong. We talked about this.
Right.
There was no representation of women or birthing people signing or creating the Constitution when it happened, and abortions were happening. People were getting abortions when the Constitution was written. And so I don't understand how this could be put into a legislation that becomes a federal law in our country and removes the right to reproductive access for millions of people, disproportionately affecting people of color. What you may also have seen is he added into his opinion that, while we're on this train of removing rights from people, we should definitely reconsider same-sex marriage, and I believe contraception is what he said. So more to fight. Our last example here for denying, minimizing, and blaming is legislators and people of power continuing to fight for abortion restrictions after Dobbs v. Jackson. And some of you may know of this, maybe you've heard of some of these things we already talked about today. This one is about Senator Lindsey Graham, who is an anti-abortion opponent and certainly fought for the ruling for Dobbs v. Jackson. In September of last year, so the ruling came out in June, just a few months later, and for the ruling, the message was, we just don't think it should be at the federal level. We think that the states are the ones that should have these decisions, right? So if we take that at face value, which it's not, but if we take them for what they say, then that would mean that there would be no more arguing for federal restrictions on abortion because they got what they wanted, it went to the states. That's not what happened. In September, he introduced a bill, which is still just a bill for now, of a new federal ban on abortion at 15 weeks. So he's continuing this fight at the federal level, despite the decisions going back to the states. And so we bring up this protest sign. I love a good pun. This is an amazing pun. I know that it's not helpful to talk about this movement or any movement in terms of Republican or Democrat or parties. And I agree with that. Yeah. And I think that we should call a spade a spade. And in this situation, that's what's happening.
So this brings up some of the experiences of some other survivors. This is Sam. And Sam came to our program and disclosed experienced sexual coercion, specifically stealthing. Can you do that? Which is, for those of you who have not heard of stealthing before, that's the non-consensual condom removal either before or during intercourse. Sometimes it's like you see here in the picture, maybe sabotaging by poking a pin or something, not necessarily just removing. But regardless, Sam felt very violated and confused about the experience. Their partner denied doing it intentionally and minimized the impact, right? It's not that big of a deal, right?
Yeah.
God. Sam identifies as non-binary and uses they and them pronouns. And so it was really important when we're addressing any services with Sam that we are affirming, and that also any services that we refer Sam to are affirming and confidential and safe for Sam.
Yeah.
So Sam was very concerned about possible exposure to sexually transmitted infections. So talking to Sam about what they felt comfortable with, different programs and what services Sam was specifically looking for, we referred Sam to Howard Brown Health Services for just in general sexual health services, including testing, post-exposure prophylactics if needed, education about safer sex and different ways to protect and different methods that are available to both protect from any infections or also pregnancy. and PrEP, so pre-exposure prophylactics, if it turned out that Sam was eligible for that. We also provided education about legal rights and safety planning in general, but then also domestic violence counseling that included really validating Sam's feelings, serious discussions around consent, and also sexual safety planning, and making sure to reinforce the entire time that this abuse was not Sam's fault.
Yeah,
Right.
right. Never the victim's fault.
Right.
Never, ever.
Never, ever, ever.
Mhm.
Although again, the partner was blaming, right?
Of course, yes.
So
they were wrong.
So what does this really mean, for where we can go today? As we mentioned, we are in a pretty good place in Illinois. We have had some successful defenses in Illinois and also some progress in recent years, going back as early as 2017. So before, I think Trump, we had the final justice on the Supreme Court. Our legislature here was in anticipation, and because of the work again of advocates like these organizations on the screen here, repealed a trigger provision on the books since 1975. So actually, after Roe v. Wade was passed, Illinois went ahead and made a trigger law provision, and so it was important that that got repealed, and that was done. So that's why we didn't have any trigger laws that went into effect as we saw in some other states. It also repealed the parental notification and waiting period requirement for those under 18 in Illinois, and it expanded public funding. So we talked about the Hyde Amendment, but actually since 2017, Illinois has required state Medicaid and state employee insurance programs to cover abortion care. And then, as you mentioned, in 2019, we went even further. And so we have the Illinois Reproductive Act, which further protected access and removed many of the harmful and medically unnecessary barriers that were previously in place. And then we saw Roe v. Wade and CAWC being overturned in 2022, and realized that, you know what, we still are not in a good enough place in Illinois, as we're seeing, and as you mentioned, there's still continued attacks, even though everyone said, oh, we're kicking this back to the states. That's obviously not true, as we've seen continued laws, proposed and being talked about.
Yeah.
So in Illinois, just this last year, we enacted HB 4664, which was a reproductive rights and gender affirming care omnibus bill, which really protects healthcare providers and patients from interference from other states. So the concern that that there would be subpoenaed medical records, for example, those kind of concerns, took some steps in doing that. Also making sure that access to medications, abortion care, medications for abortions, medications, contraceptives, as well as PrEP and PEP are readily available, and again, also paid for by insurance. But getting these bills passed has not been without opposition. And so, again, these are some organizations that CAWC has worked with over the years on these issues and continue to work with these issues. We need you to go to their websites and sign up for their action alerts so that you can join us when we are trying to either oppose or promote certain legislation that promotes or hinders access to this care. And even in a state like Illinois, we've talked just today about how accessing services is still not easy, and especially for survivors of domestic violence. So you've heard some of the ways that we work to address these issues. And so we really need your support to sustain and expand our services, to provide justice and safety for our community. So please, please, please sign up for our mailing list, assist with promoting awareness about our services, come to our events. Thanks for joining us here today again. Please talk to people about this discussion. Follow us on social media, share our posts, and join in the conversations that we're having. We'd love to also have you volunteer your time and donate to our services, of course. And my last plea, or our last plea, please, if you do nothing else, please, please, please vote. not just in the national and the general elections, but exercise your rights in local and primary elections as well. Find out what's on your ballots, educate yourself on the candidates as well as any of the referenda issues, right? We saw that happen as soon as Roe went into effect. This was kicked back to the states, and luckily we've had some successes in some other states. Congratulations to those states, and thank you to the work of the advocates in those states and also nationally for supporting this. And so we want you to support this as well. Please vote for your judges.
Yeah,
it's so important, and I know it can be overwhelming, and there's tons on the ballot. I was overwhelmed the last time, so please take a little bit of extra time, find your go-to voting guide on any and all of the issues. Again, look at some of the organizations that we mentioned previously. A lot of them will share, voting guides. In terms of in Chicago, we do have a nonprofit journalist and a nonpartisan journalist organization called Injustice Watch. And so I found their guides to be helpful in getting information about judges. And so maybe you want to go ahead and check them out. But again, just really thank you all for being here and for your support.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Megan. That is it for today's presentation. We are going to stay on for the next half hour to do a Q&A if you have any questions that have come up. But to just wrap up our content here, we would love for you to join us at our next kitchen table conversation, which is going to be on September 28th, which is another Thursday from 12 to 1. And the title for this one is "This is Why We March." And we're going to be preparing ourselves and hopefully you for our October, which is the DV Awareness Month, where we're going to hold our march and rally, walk and rally in the Chicagoland area. And so this kitchen table conversation will talk about the intersections between the civil rights movements and the domestic violence movements and the women's rights movements and public demonstrations and how we can continue those movements today. There's QR codes on here that you can snapshot with your phone for the registration, so you can get those register right away. And then just briefly, I'm going to go to this screen. We do have all of our references for this presentation here, so you will have access to all of where we got the information from. And then I'll just go back to this slide to leave the QR code up. And I guess thank you, Megan, for a wonderful discussion today. And thank you to all of our team behind us, just like you said. And we're good to transition. So if you guys could help us with any questions that come through the chat, that would be great.
Great, thanks, Lashana. And thank you all for your comments as we were going through the presentation, right? Do we have a question in the Q&A, or was that another comment? Okay, great. Well, as we're waiting to see if anyone has any final questions or comments, again, I just want to thank our development team staff here and Colleen as well for all of your help on this presentation.
Oh, right back at you, Megan. Yeah, team efforts here.
All right, there's no more questions or anything. Everyone has busy days, right?
Yeah.
Busy lives.
Yeah, and this was a lot of content that we just went through. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to close up. You have access to all of our content information. And if you don't, reach out to someone here and we'll share it with you, or give us a call. And we'll talk to you later.
We'll see you in a month.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.